Hello, darkness, my old friend. Have you ever walked down a street and felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the cold? A feeling that the smiling faces of the city conceal something truly ancient and monstrous? The story you're about to hear is one of those shadows, a tale etched into the very cobblestones of a city that seemed to have forgotten its nightmares. But nightmares have a way of waking up. Before we descend into the darkness of Hollow Street, if you enjoy tales of mystery and horror, consider subscribing to our channel and turning on notifications. It helps us keep the shadows at bay for a little while longer. Now, let the story begin. The rain in Viridia wasn't just water. It was a liquid memory, washing the neon glow of the corporate spires down into the gutters of the old quarter, where history clung to the bricks like stubborn moss. It was in these gutters that Detective Miles Corbin felt most at home. He sat in a cracked vinyl booth at the Night Owl, a diner that smelled of stale coffee and regret, the last bastion of the analog age in a city hurtling towards a digital sunrise. The rain hammered against the plate glass window, blurring the world outside into a watercolor of bleeding lights. Spread before him on the sticky tabletop was not the morning paper, but the ghosts of his career. Yellowed, dog-eared files, the corners softened by 2 decades of obsessive handling. The Sparrow case. 20 years it had been, and the ghost of it still perched on his shoulder, a weight he could never shrug off. The Sparrow had been an artist of death, targeting the city's elite with poisons so subtle they were almost mistaken for the whims of nature. He was never caught. The only suspect, a disgruntled historian named Alastair Finch, had been found dead by an apparent suicide, closing the book but never the story for Corbin. It was a failure that had burrowed deep into his soul, a quiet rot that had defined the twilight of his career. More coffee, Miles? The voice belonged to Martha, the diner's proprietor, her face a roadmap of late nights and early mornings. Corbin looked up from a faded photograph of a pressed sparrow feather, the killer's only calling card. Yeah, Martha. Keep it coming. Drowning something. You've been trying to drown that same ghost for 20 years, she said, her tone gentle as she refilled his mug. Maybe it's time you let it rest. He offered a weak, tired smile. Ghosts don't rest. That's the point of them. His phone buzzed against the table, a harsh, unwelcome intrusion. The caller ID flashed. DT. Isabella Rossi. His partner. Young, sharp, ambitious, everything he wasn't anymore. He ignored it. She'd leave a message. He wanted nothing more than to be left with his ghosts until his retirement paperwork finally cleared. 3 more months. 94 days until he could officially surrender. The phone buzzed again, insistent. With a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of every case he'd ever worked, he answered. Corbin. Miles, thank God. Where are you? Rossi's voice was tight, strained. You need to get down to Hollow Street, the old Blackwood Abattoir. Corbin's eyes narrowed. The abattoir had been shuttered for half a century, a skeletal ruin in the heart of the old quarter. What's going on, Izzy? We've got a body. And Miles, it's a scene. It's not just a murder. It's a goddamn installation. 30 minutes later, Corbin's sedan cut through the rain-slicked streets. The old quarter was a maze of narrow alleys and decaying brickwork, a place the city's relentless modernization had tried, and failed, to completely erase. The flashing blue and red lights of a dozen patrol cars painted the derelict facade of the abattoir in frantic, pulsing strokes. He ducked under the yellow tape, the familiar scent of rain, wet asphalt, and death filling his lungs. The air inside the abattoir was thick and cold, heavy with the metallic tang of old blood and the fresh, coppery scent of new. Rossi met him just inside the main slaughtering floor, her face pale under the harsh glare of the forensic team's work lights. He's over here, she said, her voice a low murmur. Brace yourself. Corbin had been a homicide detective for 30 years. He'd seen the worst of what people could do to each other. He thought he was immune, that his capacity for shock had been cauterized long ago. He was wrong. On the central processing hook, where thousands of animals had once met their end, hung the remains of a man, or rather the parts of a man. He had been expertly, almost surgically, dismembered, But this was not an act of frenzied butchery. It was one of chilling, meticulous design. The limbs, the torso, the head, they were all there, reassembled on the hook and a series of surrounding steel tables, arranged into a grotesque tableau. It was a bizarre, nightmarish sculpture that seemed to mimic the shape of an old, intricate crest or symbol. "Victim's name is Jonathan Stryker," Rossi said, reading from her notepad, her eyes refusing to linger on the scene. "CEO of Stryker Development. The man who's been buying up the old quarter block by block. A lot of people weren't happy about his plans to tear it all down for luxury condos." Corbin barely heard her. His attention was fixed on the details. The cuts were clean, precise. The killer knew anatomy. This wasn't rage. It was art. A sick, twisted form of it, but art nonetheless. He circled the scene, his old eyes missing nothing. The floor had been washed clean around the display. No footprints, no drag marks. The killer was careful. Then he saw it. Placed delicately on the victim's chest, nestled amongst the carnage, was a small, antique silver locket. It was tarnished with age, clearly out of place in the sterile, brutal environment. "Bag that," Corbin said to a nearby forensics tech, his voice a low growl. Carefully, he watched as the tech, hands trembling slightly, used a pair of tweezers to lift the locket and place it in an evidence bag. Something about it sent a cold spike of unease through him, a feeling that went beyond the horror of the scene itself. It was a deliberate statement, a signature. Back at the precinct, the sterile environment did little to dispel the chill of the abattoir. The locket lay on an examination tray under a magnifying lamp. Corbin gently pried it open. Inside, there was no picture of a loved one. There was only a single, perfectly preserved, withered flower. A small, dark purple bloom pressed flat against the velvet lining. "What do you make of it?" Rossi asked, peering over his shoulder. "It's a message," Corbin said. Stryker was a shark, a man of glass and steel. He wouldn't be caught dead with an antique like this. The killer left it. He wanted us to find it. The next morning, the media had their name for him. It was plastered across every news feed and paper. The Butcher of Hollow Street. The city, usually numb to the daily hum of violence, was terrified. This was different. This was theatrical. It was a monster from a fairy tale stepping into their modern world. Corbin and Rossi spent the next 2 days buried in the life of Jonathan Stryker. The list of people he had angered, ruined, or displaced was immense. He was a corporate titan who saw the old quarter not as a piece of history, but as undeveloped real estate. He had crushed small businesses, evicted generational tenants, and fought preservation societies with an army of lawyers. Their suspect list had hundreds of names, a sea of motives with no clear place to start. Corbin, however, couldn't shake the feeling of déjà vu. The precision, the sheer audacity of the killer's presentation, it tickled the edges of his memory, whispering of the sparrow. But the MO was worlds apart. The sparrow was a whisper, a phantom who used chemistry and patience. The butcher was a scream, a brute who used saws and knives. It couldn't be related, and yet, the feeling lingered. On the third day, the second body was found. The call came from a patrolman doing a routine check on the Grand Viridian Clock Tower, one of the few historical landmarks Stryker hadn't managed to get his hands on. The victim was City Councilwoman Eleanor Vance. She had been the deciding vote that fast-tracked Stryker's controversial zoning permits for the Old Quarter, overriding the city's Historical Preservation Committee. Corbin and Rossi were the first detectives on the scene. The clock tower's internal chamber was a cathedral of gears and brass. The rhythmic, heavy thump-clank of the mechanism a slow, metronomic heartbeat. Eleanor Vance was part of the machine. Her body had been strapped to the giant wooden hands of the clock face, visible from the inside. Her limbs were positioned to mimic the hands, pointing to a specific time, 3:15. She was fully clothed, with no visible wounds from a distance. As Corbin got closer, he saw the single, precise puncture mark at the base of her skull. An entirely different method. This killer was adaptable, versatile. And there, clutched in her cold, stiff hand, was another antique silver locket. "Get it to the lab," Corbin ordered, his voice grim. And get me the coroner's preliminary report. I want to know the time of death. An hour later, the pieces began to click into place with a sickening finality. The lab confirmed the locket contained another pressed, withered flower, this time a pale, white species. The coroner's report placed the time of death between 3 o'clock and 3:30 a.m. 3:15. The killer wasn't just murdering them. He was making them into monuments of their own demise. Corbin stood before the case board back at the precinct. Pictures of Stryker's gruesome tableau and Vance's clock-face crucifixion stared back at him. It wasn't just about their business dealings. It was about symbolism. The abattoir, a place of slaughter, for the man who butchered the dreams of the old quarter's residents. The clock tower, a monument to time, for the woman who tried to accelerate its destruction. This was a man speaking in a language of blood and architecture. The flowers, Izzy, he said, his voice barely a whisper. The flowers are the key. It's the one constant besides the lockets. I've already sent photos to the university's botany department, Rossi replied. They're running a comparison, but they said they're unusual. Not the kind of thing you find in a modern floral shop. No, Corbin said, turning from the board to face her. You wouldn't. He felt a cold certainty creeping up his spine. Get me everything you can find from the city archives. I want maps, land deeds, census records for the old quarter going back to the 19th century. Anything related to its founding. The founding? Miles, what are you looking for? I'm looking for a ghost, he said. For the rest of the day, they were buried in dusty tomes and brittle, browning maps. They learned that the entire old quarter, the bedrock of the original city, was built on reclaimed swampland. In the mid-1800s, the city fathers had drained the vast Blackwood marshes to expand Viridia, displacing the small, self-sufficient communities that had lived there for generations. It was a story of progress, the city's official history called it. Corbin saw it as a foundation of forgotten graves. His phone rang, startling him from his reverie over a hand-drawn map of the marshland. It was Dr. Eris Thorne from the university's botany department. Detective Corbin, we've identified your flowers, the botanist said, his voice filled with academic excitement. It's quite remarkable. The first one, the purple bloom from the abattoir, is a spectrosombra, or as it's more commonly known, the shadow orchid. The second, the white one, is a Luctus calla, the morning lily. Corbin scribbled the names on a legal pad. And you said they were unusual? Unusual is an understatement, detective. Both species were officially declared extinct over a century ago. According to all known records, they were endemic only to one specific ecosystem in this region, the Blackwood Marshes. The line went dead, but Corbin didn't lower the phone. He stared at the map spread across his desk, the map of the marshes that no longer existed. He looked up at the caseboard at the locations of the two murders. The abattoir, the clock tower. They weren't random. They were landmarks built directly over what the old map designated as the heart of the marsh. The butcher wasn't just killing people who wanted to destroy the city's past. He was reenacting it. He was a historian, a botanist, and a killer all rolled into one. He was drawing a new map over the old one, using the blood of his victims as ink. And with a chilling, gut-wrenching certainty, Corbin realized this was just the beginning. The killer had a list, a historical ledger, and he knew, with the kind of instinct that only 30 years of staring into the abyss could provide, exactly where the butcher of Hollow Street was going to strike next. The race against the rain-swept city streets was a frantic, desperate affair. Corbin drove, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, the wipers fighting a losing battle against the downpour. Rossi sat in the passenger seat, a laptop balanced on her knees, her face illuminated by the screen's cold, blue light as she dug into the life of their next presumed victim. Marcus Thorne, she recited, her voice tense over the wail of the siren. 82 years old, head of the Viridia Historical Society for the last 50 years. Lives alone in a massive Gilded Age mansion on the edge of the old quarter. He's a recluse, hasn't been seen in public for months. He fits the pattern, Corbin growled, swerving to avoid a city bus. The victims are pillars of the city, all connected to the destruction of its history. Stryker the destroyer, Vance the enabler. What did Thorne do? Rossi's fingers flew across the keyboard. Got it. It was all over the preservationist blogs a few months ago. Thorne, in a highly controversial move, sold the Society's entire private archive to Stryker Development. Maps, journals, deeds. The complete, unfiltered history of the city's founding. People were outraged. They said he sold the city's soul. He didn't just sell its soul, Corbin muttered, the realization dawning on him. He gave the butcher his shopping list. They screeched to a halt in front of Thorne's mansion. It was a Gothic monstrosity of stone and shadow, looking more like a mausoleum than a home. And just as Corbin had feared, they weren't the first to arrive. 2 patrol cars were already parked haphazardly at the gate, their lights painting the wrought iron in silent, strobing warnings. They were too late. A uniformed officer met them at the massive oak doors. Detectives. He's in the library. We haven't touched anything. The library was a 2-story cavern of books, its walls lined from floor to ceiling with leather-bound volumes. The air smelled of old paper, leather, and dust. Marcus Thorne sat behind a grand mahogany desk, slumped over in his chair. He looked peaceful, almost as if he had simply fallen asleep while reading. But the dark, ugly stains spreading across the white collar of his shirt and the single, precise puncture wound behind his ear told a different story. This scene was different from the others. There was no grotesque tableau, no theatrical arrangement. It was quiet, somber, almost respectful. The killer's rage, so palpable at the other scenes, was absent here. This felt personal. On the desk, directly in front of Thorne, lay an enormous, leather-bound ledger, open to a specific page. And next to it, where the killer's signature should be, sat a single, antique silver locket. Rossi approached it cautiously. Another one? Corbin shook his head, a knot tightening in his stomach. Look closer. She leaned in. The locket was open, and it was empty. His attention shifted to the ledger. The script was elegant, 19th-century cursive, written in faded iron gall ink. It was a meticulous accounting of the families who had been displaced from the Blackwood Marshes. It listed their names, their profession stanners, herbalists, farmers, and the insultingly small sums they were paid for their land. But it was the column on the far right that made Corbin's blood run cold. Beside many of the family names, a second hand had later added a simple, chilling annotation in darker ink. Perished. My God! Rossi breathed, reading over his shoulder. This isn't just a record of displacement. It's a death roll. The butcher is avenging them, Corbin said, his voice a gravelly whisper. Stryker, Vance, and now Thorne. They weren't just destroying buildings. They were trying to bury this. To bury the truth of what this city was built on. While Rossi began the methodical work of a modern investigation, tracing the digital and financial trails that connected the 3 victims, Corbin found himself drawn back into the past. He couldn't shake the feeling that the answer wasn't in bank records or encrypted emails. It was in the ink of that ledger. It was in the ghost that had haunted him for 20 years. He left Rossi to manage the scene and drove back to the precinct, the ledger carefully sealed in an evidence box on the seat beside him. He went straight to the records vault, the cold, climate-controlled room where old cases went to die. He pulled the heavy boxes containing the Sparrow file. For hours, he sat alone, surrounded by the ghosts of his greatest failure. He spread the old evidence photos, the toxicology reports, the witness statements across a table. The Sparrow's victims had also been the city's elite, men who had profited from Viridia's less savory history. They had died from obscure plant-based alkaloids, poisons that mimicked heart attacks and strokes. At each scene, the killer had left a single, pressed sparrow feather. The prime suspect, Alistair Finch, was a brilliant but bitter historian who had been fired from the university for his radical theories about the city's founding. He had publicly accused the victims' ancestors of what he called generational crimes. When the pressure of the investigation mounted, Finch was found in his study, dead from an overdose. A signed confession was on his desk. Case closed. But Corbin had always had his doubts. The confession felt too neat, the suicide too convenient. Now, looking at it through the lens of the Butcher case, the doubts screamed at him. He picked up the evidence manifest and scanned the list of items recovered from Finch's home. His eyes stopped on one entry: box of assorted academic journals and personal diaries. He found the box in the back of the vault. Inside, nestled between dense historical treatises, were Finch's personal journals. Corbin opened the first one. The pages were filled with Finch's elegant, angry script, detailing his research, his frustrations, his growing obsession with the families of the Blackwood Marshes. And then he saw it. Tucked between two pages, used as a bookmark, was a pressed flower. A small, dark purple bloom. A Spectrus umbra. The shadow orchid. Corbin's breath hitched. He frantically flipped through the other journals. He found another flower, a pale white one. A Luctus calla. The morning lily. Alastair Finch hadn't just been a historian. He had been a botanist, obsessed with the extinct flora of the Lost Marshes. The connection slammed into him with the force of a physical blow. The sparrow and the butcher. The feathers and the flowers. It wasn't a copycat. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a legacy. He pulled Finch's family history from the case file. Alastair Finch was the last living descendant of a family listed in the old ledger. A family marked with that chilling word. Perished. The butcher of Hollow Street was not just continuing the sparrow's work. He was avenging his father. Izzy, Corbin said into his phone, his voice strained, urgent. Pull up everything on Alastair Finch's family. Did he have any children? He could hear the clicking of her keyboard on the other end. Yeah, he had a son, Thomas Finch. He would have been about 10 when his father died. After Alastair's death, the boy was sent to live with distant relatives out of state. And then, he just drops off the map. No driver's license, no credit history, no social security activity. He's a ghost with a grudge. A boy who had watched the system declare his father a monster and a suicide. A boy who knew the truth and had spent the last 20 years nursing his rage, sharpening it into a weapon. Thomas Finch was the butcher. Corbin knew he couldn't just put out a bolo for a man who didn't exist on paper. Thomas was smart, meticulous. He had been planning this for 2 decades. He wouldn't be caught by conventional means. Corbin had to draw him out, to force him to make a mistake. He had to wound his pride. He called a press conference. Standing before a bank of cameras, Corbin looked weary, but resolute. He spoke of the investigation, the terror, the connections. And then he laid his trap. We now believe, he said, his voice steady, that the individual known as the Butcher is not a new entity, but a student of a killer from this city's past. He is a mere apprentice, a copycat attempting to replicate the work of the Sparrow. But where the Sparrow was subtle and intelligent, this killer is a clumsy, brutal amateur. He is nothing more than a failed apprentice, and his desperate need for attention will be his undoing. He knew Thomas would be watching. He knew the insult would cut deeper than any bullet. He had called the man's life's work, his sacred act of vengeance, a clumsy imitation. That evening, Corbin sat in his lonely apartment, the rain lashing against the windows. The city outside was on edge, a tinderbox of fear. He nursed a glass of whiskey, the Sparrow case file open on his coffee table. He was waiting. Just after midnight, the lights in his apartment flickered and died. The entire block was plunged into darkness. Power cut. In the sudden, oppressive silence, his phone rang. The number was blocked. He answered. The voice on the other end was distorted, a synthesized metallic rasp, but beneath it, he could hear the cold, controlled rage. You took my father's name in vain, detective. You stood on his grave and called him a failure. And now you speak of apprentices. The voice was calm, but filled with a terrifying venom. The student has long since surpassed the master. My father tried to use words and history. They silenced him. My methods are louder. You buried the truth under Hollow Street 20 years ago, Corbin. I'm just digging it back up. There was a pause. Corbin could hear the faint sound of dripping water in the background. Come to the old abattoir. See the master's final lesson. Come alone. The line went dead. Corbin stood in the darkness of his apartment, the phone still pressed to his ear. He knew it was a trap, a final, bloody act in a play that had started 20 years ago. But he also knew it was his only chance. A chance to catch a ghost and maybe, just maybe, to finally silence one of his own. The rain had momentarily ceased, leaving the air in the old quarter thick with the smell of wet decay and ozone. A predatory stillness had fallen over Hollow Street, broken only by the distant, mournful wail of a ship's horn from the port. Corbin pulled his car to a stop a block away from the abattoir, its skeletal frame a jagged silhouette against the bruised purple of the night sky. He was not a man given to prayer, but a quiet, desperate plea formed in his mind. Let this be the end of it. He had not come alone. Before leaving his apartment, he had made one call. Rossi. He made contact. He wants me at the abattoir. Alone. Miles, no. It's a trap. She had protested, her voice frantic. I know, he'd replied calmly. Get your best tactical team. I want them silent. I want them invisible. Set up a perimeter, cover every exit. But you do not, and I mean do not move in until you get my signal. He'll be expecting a trap, but he'll be watching for a clumsy one. We have to be smarter than him. Give me a 20-minute head start. Now, as he stepped out into the damp chill, he clipped a small, state-of-the-art microphone to his collar, the signal a live feed to Rossi's command post. He checked the Glock holstered at the small of his back. Felt heavier than usual. The main door of the abattoir groaned open under his touch, the sound of rusted metal echoing in the cavernous space. The air inside was colder than the street, still carrying the phantom chill of the meat lockers and the fresh scent of bleach. The slaughtering floor was no longer a crime scene. It had been cleaned, almost sterilized. The hooks hung empty and gleaming under a single bare work light that cast long, distorted shadows. I knew you'd come, detective. The voice came from the darkness, the same synthesized rasp from the phone call. It echoed around him, seeming to come from everywhere at once. A figure stepped out from behind a row of steel girders, emerging into the pool of light. He was of average height and build, with a gaunt face and eyes that burned with a cold, intellectual fire. He was dressed in simple, dark work clothes. This was not the face of a madman, but of a scholar, a man consumed by a singular, terrible purpose. This was Thomas Finch. You shouldn't have insulted my father's work, Thomas said, his voice now stripped of the digital distortion. It was calm, articulate, almost academic. He was an artist, pioneer. I am merely the curator of his legacy. Corbin's eyes scanned the room. Thomas was gesturing to the walls around them. They were no longer bare brick and rusting steel. They were a gallery. Intricate, disturbing sculptures made from animal bones and salvaged metalwork were mounted on the walls. Detailed, hand-drawn maps of 19th-century Viridia were pinned alongside them, annotated with Thomas's own precise, elegant script. This wasn't just a hideout. It was a museum of vengeance. Your father was a murderer, Thomas? Corbin said, his voice steady, betraying none of the tension coiling in his gut. My father was a historian. Thomas snapped, the first crack in his calm facade. He discovered the truth, that this city wasn't founded. It was stolen. It was built on the bones of families like mine. He was going to expose them. Stryker's grandfather, Vance's great-uncle, the men who ran this city. He had the ledger. He was going to bring it all to light. He took a step closer, his eyes locking onto Corbin's. But they found out. They came to his study. It wasn't a suicide, detective. They forced an overdose down his throat and wrote a confession for him. They murdered him. And you, the great Detective Corbin, eager to close the impossible case, you wrapped it up in a neat little bow. You let them get away with it. The words hit Corbin like a punch to the chest. It was the truth he had buried deep inside himself for 20 years. The doubt that had festered and rotted his career from the inside out. He had suspected, he had wondered, but he had never pushed. He had closed the case. I made a mistake, Corbin admitted, his voice hoarse. A mistake. Thomas laughed, a dry, mirthless sound. You call the desecration of a good man's name a mistake? No, it was a convenience. And for that, the city had to pay. My father whispered the truth, and they silenced him. So I decided I would scream it. He walked over to a large, cloth-draped object in the center of the room. With a theatrical flourish, he pulled the cloth away. It was a masterfully detailed scale model of the entire Old Quarter. This is my masterpiece, Thomas said, a note of pride in his voice. My final lesson. Stryker wanted to demolish the past. Vance wanted to accelerate time. Thorne sold the city's soul, leaving an empty space where its history should be. The empty locket. Did you understand the poetry of it, detective? He tapped the model. Their vision was so limited. They wanted to build on top of the past. I, however, want to return the city to its roots. Literally. He pointed to a series of small, blinking red lights scattered throughout the model. The ledger wasn't just a list of victims, detective. It was a map of the old water tables of the Blackwood Marshes. For years, I have been working in the forgotten storm drains and service tunnels beneath the Old Quarter. I have placed charges at every key structural point in the foundations, the very same points where the old marsh springs still bubble up from the earth. Corbin felt a wave of cold dread wash over him. You're going to destroy the Old Quarter. Destroy it? No, I am going to liberate it, Thomas corrected him. I will detonate the charges, flooding the foundations, collapsing the modern world into the mud it was built upon. A harvest of ghosts. The city's elite, its greedy developers, its corrupt politicians. They will all be buried in the tomb their ancestors built. A perfect, historical irony. In his hand, Thomas held a small, remote detonator. His thumb rested on the button. Corbin knew he had only seconds. Rossi and her team would be useless. He had to reach the man, not the monster. Thomas, he said, taking a careful step forward. Your father. He wouldn't have wanted this. He wanted the truth to be known, not to be buried under more rubble and more bodies. This isn't justice. It's just more pain. It's a cycle, and you have to be the one to end it. He looked at the man, seeing past the killer to the 10-year-old boy who had lost his entire world. I failed him. I admit it. I looked away when I should have dug deeper. Let me fix it. Let me give your father the justice he was denied. For the briefest of moments, a flicker of something other than hate crossed Thomas's face. A flicker of the lost little boy. He hesitated. His thumb trembled over the button. It was all the opening Corbin needed. Now, Izzy! He yelled into his mic. The sound of shattering glass and splintering would erupted as the tactical team crashed through the windows and doors. The abattoir was flooded with armed officers, laser sights painting red dots across Thomas's chest. Realizing he'd been played, Thomas's face contorted in a mask of pure rage. With a guttural scream, he lunged not for Corbin, but for the detonator. You'll all drown in your history. The world devolved into chaos. Shots rang out, echoing like thunder in the vast chamber. Corbin, moving with an instinct born of 30 years of violence, didn't draw his weapon. He charged, tackling Thomas around the waist. The momentum carried them both forward, crashing through a section of rotten wooden floorboards that had been concealed under a rubber mat. They plunged into darkness, landing with a bone-jarring splash in freezing, murky water. It was a sub-basement, a flooded cistern that was part of the original marshland, never fully drained. The fight became primal, a desperate struggle in the cold, black water. Thomas was younger, stronger, but Corbin was driven by 2 decades of guilt. He fought for redemption. The detonator slipped from Thomas's grasp, a small black shape sinking into the silt. Gasping for air, Corbin finally managed to get a grip, subduing the thrashing killer just as the tactical team's flashlights pierced the darkness from above. They emerged from the hole, soaked, gasping, and battered. The nightmare was over. Epilogue: weeks later, Viridia was a different city. The tale of Thomas Finch and his father, the Sparrow, had ripped the carefully constructed facade off the city's history. The corruption of its founding fathers was laid bare. The story was a media sensation, and Corbin was hailed as the hero who had saved the old quarter. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a man who had finally paid a long overdue debt. His retirement papers were on his desk, signed and dated. On a crisp, clear autumn afternoon, Miles Corbin walked through the gates of the Viridia Central Cemetery. He found the simple, weathered headstone he was looking for: Alastair Finch, beloved father and scholar. For years, it had been the grave of a killer and a madman. Now it was the grave of a victim. Corbin reached into his pocket and pulled out a single, perfectly pressed sparrow feather. He placed it gently on the headstone. A quiet apology. A final closing of the file. He turned and walked away, not looking back. He left the ghosts of Hollow Street to their slumber, finally at peace with his own. As he reached the cemetery gates, the rain that had plagued the city for weeks finally stopped. For the first time in a long time, a sliver of genuine sunlight broke through the clouds, bathing the old quarter in a warm, hopeful light. History had been unearthed, and now, perhaps, the city could truly begin to heal.